The train moved slowly through the quiet American night, its windows dim, its passengers half asleep, unaware that beneath the calm rhythm of steel on rails, they were passing through a place where history had quietly buried something it never intended to reveal. In the early decades of the 20th century, long before highways carved through the deserts and plains of the United States, trains were the silent lifelines of the country. They carried not just people and goods, but stories, thousands of them, moving steadily across states like Nevada, Utah, and California. Some of those stories were loud and proud, others were meant to disappear. Out in the Nevada desert, far from the growing cities and well beyond the reach of ordinary travelers, there existed a stretch of railway that few people spoke about. Official records showed nothing unusual, just another line connecting remote mining operations to the rest of the country. But the workers who had once been assigned there remembered something different. They remembered how the trains would sometimes arrive late at night, long after schedules had ended. No passengers would step off, no cargo was visibly unloaded, and yet the guards posted along the tracks were not the usual railway staff. They were quiet, disciplined, and carried themselves with a seriousness that suggested something far more official. One former worker, decades later, would describe those nights in a slow, thoughtful tone. He said the air itself felt heavier when those trains passed through, as if the desert, vast and open as it was, chose to hold its breath. The man had been young then, barely in his 20s, working maintenance along the tracks. His job was simple: inspect, repair, report. But even simple jobs have a way of leading people into places they were never meant to see. One evening, after a long and uneventful shift, he noticed something unusual. A train had been scheduled to pass earlier that afternoon, but it never arrived. That wasn't entirely uncommon. Delays happened, but as the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert cooled, he heard it. A distant, low hum. Not the sharp, rhythmic clatter of a normal train. This sound was smoother, almost controlled. It grew slowly louder, cutting through the silence of the desert night like a quiet warning. Curious and perhaps a little too confident, he moved closer to the tracks. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The train that emerged from the darkness was unlike the others he had seen before. Its exterior was darker, almost blending into the night itself. The windows were either covered or simply not there. There was no visible numbering, no company markings, nothing that would identify its origin. And yet it moved with absolute precision. It slowed as it approached a section of track that, according to official maps, led nowhere significant. No station, no depot, just open land and distant hills. But as the train came to a stop, something unexpected happened. A section of the ground, barely noticeable in daylight, seemed to shift. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it clearly, the earth itself opening, revealing what looked like a hidden entrance built directly into the desert floor. There were no bright lights, no loud machinery. Everything moved quietly, efficiently, as if it had been practiced countless times before. The doors of the train opened. From where he stood, he couldn't see everything, but he could see enough to know that whatever was being moved that night was not ordinary cargo. Figures stepped out, dressed in uniforms he didn't recognize. They moved quickly, carrying sealed containers that reflected just enough light to reveal their metallic surfaces. There were no labels, no markings, nothing to suggest what was inside. The entire operation was conducted in near silence. No shouting, no unnecessary movement, just the soft sound of boots on gravel and the faint hum of machinery hidden beneath the ground. He should have left, Every instinct told him to walk away, to pretend he had seen nothing. But curiosity has a quiet way of holding people in place, even when they know better. He stayed, and that decision would change the way he understood history itself. As the last of the containers disappeared into the hidden structure, one of the figures paused. For a brief moment, the man turned his head just slightly, as if he had sensed something. Their eyes didn't meet, not exactly, but the worker felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being noticed. The train remained still for a few more minutes. Then, just as quietly as it had arrived, it began to move again. The ground sealed itself behind it, leaving no visible trace of what had just occurred. By morning, the desert looked exactly as it always had, empty, silent, ordinary. When the worker reported what he had seen, the response was calm but firm. There were no records of such a train, no authorization for any activity in that area. He was advised, politely but clearly, to focus on his assigned duties and avoid unnecessary speculation. And so, like many others before him, he said nothing more. Years passed. The rail line was eventually decommissioned, replaced by modern routes and expanding highways. The workers moved on. The desert remained. But stories have a way of lingering, even when the places that created them are forgotten. Decades later, historians would begin to uncover fragments of information, small, seemingly unrelated details buried within government archives and personal journals, references to restricted transport routes, mentions of classified shipments during a time when the country was rapidly expanding its military and technological capabilities. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that proved what the worker had seen, but enough to raise questions. Questions about what had been moved through those deserts under the cover of darkness. Questions about how many similar operations had taken place across the country, hidden in plain sight. And perhaps most quietly of all, questions about whether some parts of history were never meant to be fully understood. The desert, after all, is very good at keeping secrets. The years passed gently, almost unnoticed, as they often do in quiet parts of the American landscape. The rail line in Nevada slowly faded from memory, replaced by newer routes, smoother highways, and the steady hum of progress. Towns that once depended on the railroad adapted or disappeared. Workers who had spent their youth maintaining tracks and watching distant horizons grew older, their stories softening with time. But some memories never quite settled. The young worker, now an old man, had long since left the desert behind. He lived in a small town far from Nevada, where life moved at a slower, more predictable pace. Mornings were quiet, afternoons even quieter, and nights carried a calm stillness that many people found comforting. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, not because he had forgotten, but because the memory never quite fit into ordinary conversation. It wasn't something you could explain over coffee or bring up in casual company. It lingered in the background of his thoughts, like a distant sound you can't quite identify. Still, as he grew older, he began to notice something. Small things at first. A newspaper article mentioning classified rail shipments during wartime. A documentary briefly referencing hidden facilities in remote parts of the country. A passing comment from a historian about how certain operations were never fully documented. Individually, none of it meant much, but together they formed a quiet pattern, and patterns have a way of drawing attention. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across his living room, the old man sat with a stack of papers spread out before him. Clippings, notes, and copies of archived records he had slowly gathered over the years. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply wanted to understand. There were references to increased rail activity in the Nevada region during the 1940s, not unusual given the demands of the time. The United States was deeply involved in global conflict, and transportation networks were under constant pressure. But some entries stood out. Shipments listed without clear destinations, routes that appeared briefly in records only to disappear again, mentions of temporary facilities constructed and then removed with little explanation. Nothing definitive, just fragments. Yet the more he read, the more familiar it all felt, like pieces of a story he had already seen but never fully understood. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The memory returned, not sharply, but softly, like a dream revisited after many years. The quiet train, the hidden entrance, the silence of the men who moved without speaking. He had spent decades wondering if he had misinterpreted what he saw, whether time had changed the details, reshaped the moment into something it wasn't. But now he wasn't so sure. Across the country, similar stories had begun to surface. Not loudly, not in headlines or official reports, but in small, personal accounts. A retired engineer recalling a train that never appeared on schedules. A former military clerk mentioning documents that were sealed before they could be filed. A historian noting inconsistencies in transportation logs from the mid-20th century. Each story was incomplete, but they all shared a quiet resemblance. It was never enough to confirm anything, but it was enough to wonder. One particular document caught his attention. It was a copy of an internal memo dated decades earlier. The language was formal, precise, and carefully worded, as most official documents are. It referenced a temporary logistical transfer point located somewhere in the Nevada desert. No exact coordinates, no detailed description, just a brief mention that the site would be decommissioned upon completion of operations, and that all related records would be restricted under standard protocol. He read the line several times. Decommissioned. It was a simple word, but it carried a certain finality. If the site had been removed, as the document suggested, then there would be nothing left to find. No structure, no entrance, no visible trace of what had once existed. Just desert. Endless, quiet desert. And yet, something about that conclusion felt incomplete. Because while structures can be removed and records can be sealed, the land itself remains. And sometimes the land remembers. Weeks later, driven by a quiet curiosity he could no longer ignore, the old man made a decision. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, just a calm, steady choice. He would go back. The journey took time. The Nevada desert had not changed much in appearance, but the paths leading through it were different now. Roads had shifted, landmarks had faded. The precise location he remembered was difficult to find. But memory, even after many years, has a way of guiding people. He drove slowly, following instincts more than directions, until the landscape began to feel familiar in a way he couldn't quite explain. Wide open space, low, distant hills, a silence that felt deeper than ordinary quiet. He stopped the car and stepped out. The air was still. No wind, no movement, just the vast openness of the desert stretching in every direction. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. Not for anything specific, just listening. Of course, there was nothing to hear. No trains, no machinery, no hidden doors opening beneath the ground. only the faint sound of his own breathing and the distant call of something far away. He walked a short distance, his steps slow and deliberate. There were no visible signs of what he had once seen. No markings, no structural remains, nothing that would suggest any kind of human activity had ever taken place there. If someone had arrived without knowing the story, they would have seen only an empty landscape, peaceful, ordinary. And yet, as he stood there, he felt something familiar. Not fear, not even unease, just a quiet sense that this place had once held something important, something carefully hidden. He looked out across the desert, the sunlight now softer as the day moved toward evening. For a brief moment, he imagined the scene as it had been, the train emerging from the darkness, the ground opening silently, the figures moving with quiet precision. Then, just as gently, the image faded, replaced once again by stillness. He didn't stay long. There was nothing more to see, and perhaps nothing more to understand. Some stories, he realized, are not meant to be fully uncovered, not because they are impossible to find, but because they were never intended to be complete. As he returned to his car, the desert behind him remained unchanged, silent, endless, and patient, as if it had all the time in the world to keep its secrets. The drive back felt longer than the journey out, not because of distance, but because something in his mind had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. The desert had offered no answers, no clear evidence, nothing he could point to and say, "This is what I saw." And yet the absence of proof did not feel like the end of the story. If anything, it felt like the beginning of a different kind of question. In the weeks that followed, the old man returned to his routine. Mornings with coffee, afternoons with quiet reading, evenings that faded gently into night. On the surface, everything remained the same, but beneath that calm, his thoughts had become more focused. He no longer questioned whether the event had happened. Instead, he began to wonder why. Why that location? Why such secrecy? And most of all, why move something in that way, under those conditions, with such careful silence? He revisited the documents he had collected over the years, this time with a different perspective. Instead of looking for confirmation, he looked for context. What was happening in the United States during the time he had worked on that rail line? The answer, of course, was complex. The mid-20th century had been a period of rapid change. Technological advancements were accelerating, military projects were expanding, entire programs were being developed in secrecy, often far from public view. Nevada, in particular, had become a place where certain activities could be conducted without drawing attention. Wide open land, sparse population, natural isolation. It was, in many ways, the perfect setting. He found references to testing grounds, research facilities, and temporary installations that appeared and disappeared over the years. Most of them were eventually acknowledged, at least in part, but not all. Some entries remained incomplete, some records ended abruptly, and some locations were mentioned only once, never to appear again. One evening, while reviewing a collection of archived transportation logs, he noticed something subtle but unusual, a pattern in the timing. Several shipments, spread across different months and even different years, all passed through a similar region of Nevada. The routes were not identical, but they shared a common intersection point, an area that, according to official maps, had no significant infrastructure. No station, no facility, nothing that would justify repeated logistical activity, unless, of course, something had existed there temporarily. He traced the entries carefully, noting the dates, the frequencies, the gaps between them. The shipments were not constant. They appeared in intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months, as if whatever operation had taken place was not continuous, but scheduled, deliberate, controlled. He leaned back again, letting the information settle. A quiet realization began to form. What he had witnessed that night had not been a one-time event. It had been part of a system designed to move something important enough to require secrecy, precision, and isolation. But systems, no matter how well designed, rarely operate in complete silence forever. They leave traces, not obvious ones, but small, almost invisible signs that something once existed. He began to look for those signs, not in official records this time, but in personal accounts, letters, journals, recorded interviews, stories told quietly, often dismissed or forgotten. And slowly, patiently, he found them. A construction worker who had been assigned to a temporary project in the desert, only to be reassigned without explanation weeks later. A driver who recalled delivering supplies to a location that did not appear on any map. A technician who mentioned working underground, though he could not clearly describe where. Each account was incomplete, each one missing details, but together they formed something larger. Not a clear picture, but an outline, and within that outline, a possibility. The old man did not rush to conclusions. He understood the nature of memory, the way stories can change over time. He knew that not everything he read could be taken at face value. And he also understood something else. When enough separate accounts begin to align, even loosely, they begin to carry weight. They begin to suggest that something real once existed, something structured, something intentional. One night, as rain tapped softly against his window, he sat with all his notes spread out once more. The room was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of water outside. He looked at the timeline he had created, the shipments,
the locations, the personal accounts. And then, almost without thinking, he drew a line. Not a straight line, but a connection. From the rail activity, to the temporary site, to the disappearance of records, to the silence that followed. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to understand the shape of the story. And sometimes, understanding the shape is all that remains. He folded the papers carefully, placing them back into their folder. There was a sense of calm in the act. Not satisfaction exactly, but acceptance. Whatever had been moved through that desert, whatever had been stored beneath its surface, had been part of a moment in history that was never meant to be fully revealed. And now, decades later, it remained just out of reach. Not hidden completely, but not fully visible either. Somewhere in between. Like the memory of a sound you can almost hear, but never quite catch. The old man turned off the light and sat for a moment in the darkness. Outside, the rain continued, steady and quiet. Inside, his thoughts slowed. He no longer felt the need to search further, not because the mystery had been solved, but because it had been understood in its own quiet way. The desert had kept its secret. And perhaps that was always the point. For a while, everything remained still. Days passed into weeks, and the quiet rhythm of life returned as it always does. The old man no longer spent his evenings searching through records or tracing patterns across fading documents. The folder he had carefully built over the years now rested untouched on a shelf, gathering a thin layer of dust. It might have ended there, a story remembered, partially understood, and then gently set aside. But history, especially the kind that is never fully told, has a way of returning when it is least expected. It began with a letter. Not an official document, not something marked with authority or urgency, just a simple envelope, delivered among the usual mail, its presence unremarkable in every way, except for one detail. There was no return address. The old man noticed it immediately. He turned the envelope over in his hands, studying it with quiet curiosity. The paper felt ordinary. The handwriting, however, was careful, almost deliberate, as if the person who wrote it had taken their time. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature, just a short message. Some places are not meant to be remembered, but they are never truly gone. He read the line once, then again. There was no explanation, no additional detail, only a set of numbers written beneath the sentence. Coordinates. For a long moment, he simply sat there, the paper resting lightly in his hand. It could have been a coincidence, a mistake, something sent to the wrong address, but something felt intentional. He stood, walked quietly to his desk, and unfolded an old map. The coordinates were easy enough to check. With careful movements, he traced the numbers across the grid. The location they pointed to was not far from where he had been before. Not the exact same place, but close. Close enough to matter. He leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, though his thoughts had begun to shift once more. He had not spoken to anyone about his visit to the desert. He had shared no details, made no public inquiries. As far as he knew, there was no reason for anyone to contact him, especially not like this. And yet, the letter had found him, quietly, precisely. The room felt still again, the same calm atmosphere he had grown used to. But beneath that calm, something subtle had returned. Not urgency, not fear, just a quiet pull. The kind that doesn't demand action, but invites it. He folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table. Hours passed. The daylight faded. Evening settled in, and still the thought remained. By the time night had fully arrived, the decision had already been made. The next morning, he prepared for the journey once again. There was no rush in his movements. He packed only what he needed, checked his vehicle, and set out with the same steady pace as before. The road stretched out ahead of him, familiar in some ways, different in others. The landscape shifted gradually as he moved farther from town, the signs of everyday life thinning until they disappeared entirely. The desert returned, wide, silent, unchanged. But this time, his destination was more precise. The coordinates guided him, leading him off the main path and onto a less traveled route. The ground became rougher, the terrain more uneven, until eventually he reached a point where the road could go no further. He stopped the car and stepped out. The air felt the same as before, still, quiet, almost weightless. He looked around, comparing what he saw to what he remembered. The area was similar, but not identical. The hills were arranged differently. The open space felt narrower somehow. He walked forward slowly, the paper with the coordinates folded in his pocket. There was no obvious marker, no sign that anything unusual had ever taken place there. Just sand, rock, and distance. But as he moved farther from the car, something caught his attention. A faint line in the ground. Not natural. Too straight. Too deliberate. He followed it carefully. It stretched across the desert floor, subtle enough to be missed by anyone looking closely. It wasn't a crack or a shadow. It was
was something else. A seam. The realization came quietly, not with surprise, but with a kind of recognition. He had seen something like this before, years ago.
On a different night, in a different place, he stopped walking. The silence around him deepened, as if the desert itself had become aware of his presence. He waited. Nothing moved. Nothing changed, and yet the feeling remained. That same quiet sense that something existed just beneath the surface, not visible, not active, but not entirely gone either. He stood there for a long time, his eyes resting on the faint line in the ground. The sun shifted slowly overhead, the light changing as the day moved forward. Still, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, no hidden doors opening as they had before. Eventually, he took a step back, then another. There was no frustration in his expression, no disappointment, only understanding. Whatever had once operated in this place was no longer active. If it had ever returned, it was not doing so now. The letter had not led him to a discovery, it had led him to a reminder, a quiet confirmation that the story he had witnessed was part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single moment in time. He looked down once more at the seam in the earth. Then, without hesitation, he turned and began walking back toward his car. The desert remained still behind him, unchanged, unspoken, but no longer entirely unknown. The return journey felt quieter than before, not empty, but settled, like a thought that had finally found its place. The old man drove through the long stretches of desert road without distraction, the horizon steady, the sky wide and open above him. He didn't rush. There was nothing chasing him, nothing waiting ahead, just the quiet understanding that whatever he had been looking for was no longer something he needed to find. And yet, the letter remained, folded neatly, resting in his pocket. A simple message, a set of coordinates, no explanation, no name. When he arrived home, he placed the paper on his desk and sat down, studying it again under the soft light of the room. Some places are not meant to be remembered, but they are never truly gone. The words felt different now, less mysterious, more intentional, as if they had not been written to confuse, but to guide. He leaned back slightly, letting his thoughts settle. If someone had sent this letter, then someone knew, not just about the place, but about him. That realization didn't bring fear, it brought clarity, because it meant one thing: he had not been the only one watching. Days passed, quietly as they always did, but this time something subtle had changed in the way he moved through them. His attention had shifted, not outward toward records and history, but inward toward memory itself. He began to revisit that night again, not the surface details, not the train or the figures or the hidden entrance, but the smaller things, the things he had overlooked, the feeling of the air, the exact timing of events, the way everything had unfolded with such precision. Memory, when approached carefully, has a way of revealing what it once hid, and slowly, piece by piece, something began to stand out, a detail so small he had dismissed for years: the sound. He had always remembered the train being quiet, unusually quiet, but now, as he focused more closely, he realized something else. It hadn't just been quiet, it had been controlled. There had been no variation, no irregular rhythm, no mechanical inconsistency. Every movement, every shift in sound had been smooth, perfectly consistent, more consistent than any train he had ever worked with. He opened his eyes slowly. That kind of precision wasn't typical of the rail systems he had known, not at that time, not in that place, which meant the train itself might not have been ordinary, not just in appearance, but in function. He sat up slightly, his attention sharpening. If the transport system had been different, then what it carried might have required that difference, something sensitive, something that couldn't be moved through normal channels. The thought didn't arrive as a sudden realization. It arrived gently, as most truths do when they've waited long enough. This had never been about hiding something random. It had been about protecting something specific. That evening, as the sky outside turned a soft shade of gray, he returned once more to the folder on his shelf. He hadn't planned to open it again, but now it felt necessary. He laid the papers out carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. This time, he wasn't looking for patterns in locations or timelines. He was looking for something else: descriptions, technical details, anything that might hint at the nature of what had been transported. Most of the documents were vague, as he expected, but one entry, brief, almost overlooked, caught his attention. A reference to a contained material requiring stable conditions during transport. No further explanation, no classification, just that single line. He read it several times. Stable conditions. That would explain the precision, the controlled movement, the absence of noise and disruption. Whatever it was, it had required care, not just secrecy, but protection. He placed the paper down gently, and for the first time, a clearer picture began to form. Not complete, but clearer.
Hidden, not because it was dangerous in the moment, but because of what it might represent. The room felt quieter now, not in sound, but in understanding. He looked again at the letter, at the simple, steady handwriting, at the message that had brought him back to the desert. And then, almost without thinking, he turned the paper over. There, barely visible under the right angle of light, was something he had missed before. An impression, not ink, not written, pressed lightly into the paper, as if it had been beneath another sheet when something was written above it. He adjusted the angle slightly, letting the light catch it just right. Slowly, faintly, the shape became clearer. Letters. Incomplete, but readable. He leaned closer, careful, focused, and then, quietly, he saw it. A word, or part of one. Archive. He didn't move for a moment. The word lingered in his mind, connecting itself to everything he had seen, everything he had read, everything he had tried to understand. Not a storage facility, not a testing ground, an archive. The realization settled gently but firmly. Whatever had been moved through that desert, whatever had been hidden beneath its surface, it had not been something new. It had been something old, something worth keeping, something that for reasons unknown had been removed from the visible world and placed somewhere it would not be disturbed. He sat back slowly, the room unchanged, the night deepening outside. And for the first time, the mystery no longer felt like something distant or unreachable. It felt complete, not solved, but whole. Somewhere, at some point in history, something had been quietly preserved, moved through the darkness, stored beneath the earth, and then, just as quietly, left behind. Not forgotten, but set aside, as if waiting, not to be discovered, but to remain. The old man folded the letter one final time and placed it back into the folder. He did not search further. He did not return to the desert again, because now he understood something simple. Not every part of history is meant to be uncovered. Some parts are meant to be kept, not hidden out of fear, but protected by silence. And sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that last the longest. For several days, the word stayed with him, archive. It wasn't a word that suggested danger in the usual sense. It didn't carry the urgency of weapons or the secrecy of active operations. Instead, it carried something quieter, something deliberate, preservation, care, intention. The old man moved through his routine as always, but his thoughts returned to that word again and again, turning it slowly, examining it from different angles. An archive of what? That question did not rush him. It settled gently, like everything else in this story. Because now, for the first time, he wasn't searching for something hidden. He was trying to understand something that had already been found long before him. One evening, as the light outside softened into dusk, he sat by the window with the folder open once more. But instead of focusing on the documents, he closed his eyes. Memory, he had learned, was not just about images. It was about feeling, about atmosphere, about the details that don't always appear in words. He returned slowly to that night in the desert, the train, the silence, the figures. But this time, he paid attention to something he had ignored before, the way those figures had moved. There had been no urgency, no tension, no sign of fear. They had not behaved like people handling something dangerous. They had behaved like people handling something important, something valuable, something that required respect more than caution. He opened his eyes. That difference mattered, because it changed the nature of the entire event. This had not been about hiding a threat. It had been about protecting something that already existed. The next piece came quietly, not from memory, but from a detail he had nearly overlooked in one of the older records. A brief mention, barely a sentence, referring to the transfer of historical materials requiring environmental stability. At the time, he had dismissed it as vague, possibly unrelated. But now, in the context of everything else, it felt different. Historical materials. Not equipment, not technology, materials. The word suggested objects, physical things, items that could be stored, preserved, archived. He leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. If something had been moved and stored beneath the desert, and if it had been described even briefly as historical, then the operation he had witnessed might not have been about the future at all. It might have been about the past. That realization did not come with excitement. It came with a quiet, steady weight. Because the past, especially in a country as vast and complex as the United States, holds more than just well-known events and documented history. It holds fragments, artifacts, records that never made it into public view, stories that were never fully told, and sometimes things that were never meant to be widely known.
He stood and walked slowly to the shelf where the folder had rested for so many years. But instead of reaching for it again, he paused. His gaze shifted to something else, an old photograph, framed simply, sitting beside a stack of books. It wasn't related to the desert, not directly. It showed a group of men standing near a rail line somewhere in the American West. The image was faded, its edges worn slightly with time. He picked it up, studied it. There was nothing unusual about it at first glance. Workers, tools, a stretch of track disappearing into the distance. But then his eyes moved to the background. Far behind the group, barely visible, was a structure, low, partially obscured, easy to miss. He had seen it before, not in person, but in feeling, in shape, in presence. Something about it echoed the memory of that hidden entrance in the desert. He sat down slowly, the photograph still in his hands. The realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, gently, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. What if the site he had seen had not been built for that specific operation? What if it had already existed, repurposed, reused, adapted for something new, something that required the same qualities: isolation, stability, silence? The idea settled into place. An underground structure, built at some point in the past, perhaps for mining, storage, or early infrastructure, later quietly transformed into something else, an archive not just of data or documents alone, but of physical history, objects, artifacts, possibly items considered too sensitive, too rare, or too significant to be placed in ordinary collections. He placed the photograph back down carefully. The room felt still again, but in a different way now. Not empty, not uncertain, but complete. The story had never been about a hidden experiment, or a mysterious cargo, or even the train itself. Those had simply been parts of a process. The real story had been something much quieter, something older. A decision made at some point in history to take certain pieces of the past and place them somewhere they would not be disturbed, not lost, not destroyed, just removed, held in silence. He thought again of the letter, of the coordinates, of the seam in the earth that marked something just beneath the surface. And then, for the first time, a different question appeared. Not what was stored there, but who decided it should be stored at all. Because archives do not create themselves, they are built, organized, chosen, which meant someone somewhere had decided what was important enough to keep and what could be left behind. The old man leaned back in his chair, his breathing slow, his thoughts steady. There was no need to search further, no need to return to the desert. The answers, or at least the shape of them, were already here, not in full detail, but in quiet understanding. Somewhere beneath the vast, silent landscape of the Nevada desert, something remained, not active, not visible, but present. An archive, hidden not out of fear, but out of intention. A collection of pieces of the past, carefully preserved beyond the reach of time and attention. And perhaps, most quietly of all, a reminder that history is not only what we are told, it is also what is chosen to be kept in silence. The old man closed his eyes for a moment, not in exhaustion, but in calm, because the story, in its own quiet way, had reached its end, not with revelation, not with proof, but with understanding. And sometimes that is enough. Night settled gently over the town, the kind of quiet night where nothing feels urgent and even time seems to slow down. The old man sat in his chair, the room dimly lit, the soft hum of the outside world barely noticeable through the walls. The story, as far as he could tell, had reached its natural end. There were no more documents to read, no more places to visit, no more questions that needed answers, only a quiet understanding that something had existed, and still did, in its own way. He reached for the folder one last time, not to search, not to analyze, just to close it properly. Inside were the pieces he had gathered over the years, notes, records, memories, and now the letter. Each one incomplete on its own, but together forming something that felt whole. He placed the letter on top. For a brief moment, his hand rested there. Then he closed the folder, slowly, deliberately, as if sealing something that did not need to be opened again. The days that followed were calm. Nothing unusual happened, No more letters arrived, no unexpected details appeared. Life continued in its steady, predictable rhythm. Morning light through the window, afternoon silence, evenings that faded into stillness. And yet, something subtle had changed, not in the world around him, but in the way he saw it. Because now, when he thought about history, he no longer imagined it as a complete record of everything that had ever happened. He saw it differently, as something shaped, selected, organized not only by what was known, but by what was chosen to remain unknown. One evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of blue-gray, he stepped outside. The air was cool, the street quiet. He looked up for a moment, his eyes resting on the open sky above him, vast, uninterrupted, much like the desert he had once stood in. There was a certain comfort in that similarity, a quiet reminder that some places and some stories do not need to be understood in order to be real. He thought again briefly of the train, the smooth, controlled movement, the silent operation beneath the earth, the careful way everything had been handled. At the time, it felt mysterious, unexplainable. Now it felt purposeful, as its every detail had been part of something larger, something that extended far beyond a single night or a single location. He returned inside and sat down once more. The room was exactly as it had been. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt settled, complete. He no longer felt the quiet pull to search for more, no need to uncover, no need to confirm, because the story had never been about discovering a hidden truth. It had been about recognizing that some truths exist quietly, without needing to be revealed. The folder remained closed, undisturbed, a small, simple object resting on a shelf. But within it, a story remained, not written in full, not explained in detail, but present, in memory, in fragments, in understanding. And somewhere far away, beneath the vast, silent expanse of the Nevada desert, the archive remained as well, unseen, untouched, holding whatever it had been chosen to hold, not waiting to be found, not meant to be opened, just existing, as it always had. The old man leaned back in his chair, his eyes slowly closing, the quiet of the room wrapped gently around him, and for the first time in many years, there was nothing left to wonder, no questions lingering at the edges of thought, no unfinished pieces, only calm. Outside, the night continued, steady and silent, and the story, like so many others in history, settled into that same quiet place, not lost, not forgotten, but softly held just beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, where some stories are meant to remain forever.